Hello, and welcome to my presentation of Return to Work Evaluations, Best Practices for Responders, for Responding to Officer-Involved Shootings. My name is Amy Blackman, and I'm a graduate student in Military and Emergency Responder Psychology at CSU Global, and I appreciate you all being here today, and especially for asking me to create and present this presentation. Some talking points today. We're going to talk about officer-involved shootings, just some considerations, the importance of officers meeting with a mental health provider after an officer-involved shooting, how soon after an officer-involved shooting should the officer or officers involved appear for their return-to-work evaluation, what is covered in a return-to-work evaluation, and the information what information from that report actually gets reported to the referring police department. And I'm going to end the talk with what if the mental health professional that does the return to work evaluation, what if they have concerns about the officer returning to work? So we'll tap on that just a little bit. All right, so we'll start on the considerations. Pardon me, I have a little bit of a cold. The very nature of police work places officers in contact with some of society's most dangerous people, and on occasion, they must take a life in order to preserve their life or the life of others. As the years progress, there are more officer-involved shootings that involve individuals that were armed with a weapon at the time and were shot upon reaching for their weapon, violently responding to the officers, and or acting in a way that put other people's lives at risk. If this trend continues, it makes sense that we will actually see an increase of officer-involved shootings, which makes it imperative for this department to have the means to properly react and take care of our officers. And again, I applaud you for asking me to develop this presentation. I think it's very useful. All right, so an important consideration is how many officer-involved shootings are there in the United States each year. Now we can see this graph depicts deadly officer-involved shootings by race, and that was more of a convenience. It broken up into race. It just was a good graphic, so I wasn't looking for that specifically, but the total numbers and the differentiation of the races are extremely interesting. I think particularly oddly, the unknown race, there's quite a few, especially in 2022. So, yeah, that's a little baffling, but besides the point. And so from 2017 to October 22nd, I have more data in the next slide because this one actually, they stopped not reporting, but recording for their paper to come out. And so the next set of data I have discusses throughout 2024, which is pretty impressive because it's only the beginning of January. So that's kind of cool. But anyway, generally speaking, most data collection does not include officer-involved shootings that involved accidents. One that comes to mind is the police officer in New York who drew her service pistol instead of her taser and ended up killing the victim, essentially, and she got into pretty big trouble for that. That was big, but we don't really see the differentiation in this data. Also, suicide by cop. I'd love to see that data pulled out, and I think just putting the data into more clear perspective, shall we say? So, but anyway, you know, there was no official tracking, and this is according to the FBI, but there was no formal tracking or like regulation around individual police departments reporting their officer-involved shootings, regardless of the situation, the specifics, to the FBI. The FBI was like, they haven't been doing that regularly until about 2021. So I would be interested to see future data that shows more true data. I'll leave it at that. All right, so this is the most recent data I could find. Again, it's all inclusive of 2024, which just ended, 2 weeks ago, almost. The number of fatal police shootings across the U.S. has risen in recent years, with the most recorded last year, in 2023, and that was 1,164 fatal officer-involved shootings across the United States. That was an increase of 114 from just 2 years before that in 2021. And then the good news is in 2024, we, across the United States, saw 31 fewer officer-involved shootings, which is good. And then specifically in Colorado, 2024 saw 38 fatal police shootings. 33 of those 38 victims were armed. And I checked out all of the police reports, and one was armed with a gun, one an axe, a knife, a different sharp object that wasn't differentiated, and then a metal pipe. So this is what the officers are coming into, often leading to the shooting. And because this is the Denver Police Department, I want to point out that in 2024, 5 of those 38 victims had related mental illness. Now, I point that out because that in itself, that interaction itself with that particular type of person, that sounds horrible, would have an impact on the psychology of the officers involved. We'll tap on that later in the presentation, but that means that, I should point out, 4 of the 38 victims were shot and killed in Denver. So, of course, we have at least 4 involved officers. I would imagine to say many more than that, actually, because, again, we're looking at not just the officer that pulled the trigger, but we're also looking at all of the other officers that were around at the same time on the scene. 4 of the victims were shot and killed in Denver, like I said. And this was before my time. I'd need to actually take the time to find out, what did happen with these officers involved. What kind of services did they need, request, or deny? All of that information would be interesting, and I look forward to grabbing that out of the files. So, they likely needed a fitness for duty evaluation or a return to work evaluation before getting back on duty. Again, I'm going to have to research those individual cases. Alrighty. So, although legally permissible in certain circumstances, again, to save the life of another officer and or bystanders, but an officer's use of deadly force has been considered and reported to be an undeniably one of the most serious of all government acts. And how can we argue with that? But again, and I think it's important to kind of say throughout that the officer that pulled the trigger is not the only officer involved. We've got other officers, public safety employees that were on the scene, the department leadership, of course, politicos, the community at large. They're also involved in the aftermath of an officer-involved shooting. And obviously, they garner a lot of media attention, again, depending on the case, the facts of the case or the presumptions of the case, but it's always under great scrutiny. So, not just the officer, but the department that the officer works for. So, it's important to note when I talk about seriousness of the officer-involved shooting, a lot of that comes from how it's reported. Are they reporting racial disparity? Are we talking, is politics getting involved? Is there, was the victim armed or not? That's big. And although we're only discussing police officers today, I think it's important for us to recognize the widespread effect that an officer-involved shooting has. All right. Officers involved in an officer-involved shooting need access to mental health services soon after the high-intensity critical incident. There's some debate on that, which I'll tap on in just a sec. But for some public safety agencies, they have implemented psychological first aid. A lot of that is in place of critical incident debriefings, a lot of research and public opinion and opinion of the emergency responders are that it's not helpful. The fact that it's mandated really sucks. And not all of us react the same. So with that said, the quote here, the assumption that most officers will be negatively impacted by an officer-involved shooting to the point where their ability to function on the job is at jeopardy, very critical, should be questioned as it is not supported by current research. I did enough research for this presentation that I would tend to agree with that. So, and again, as we talked about, like not all officers are going to be negatively affected by their involvement in a shooting. Some may not appear to really be negatively affected at all. And some may never suffer distressing, let alone debilitating mental health symptoms. But that's not to say that an officer's subsequent involvement in a shooting wouldn't trigger these distressing psychological symptoms. So we need to certainly be aware and prepared for that. And we just hope that the officers or officer or whatever is open and honest about their struggles so we can get them the help they need in an expedient manner. So, of course, that's where I come in as well. And it's also important to note that although an officer may deny any psychological issues after a shooting, that doesn't preclude their leadership from essentially mandating them to take to go through either a fitness for duty evaluation or a return to work evaluation. So even if the officer is like, no, I'm fine, everything's cool, a lot of that could be overlooked by the leadership and say, you know what, why don't you go see somebody, go get that checked out or whatever, and that becomes a formal, either, like I said, fitness for duty evaluation or a return to work evaluation. But again, either way, the reason for the referral from the department has to be based on objective concerns about the officer's ability to perform their duties, and that's essential. We'll tap on that in a little bit. There's my Midwestern, all my words just went together. All right. So, still talking about the importance of officers meeting with someone after a mental health provider after an officer after they're involved in a shooting. Again, too many words. These are obviously emotionally charged events that require a rapid response and thorough investigation, and this is going to be the departmental, the legal aspects of it, the politicos are going to get involved. So I think in a way to prepare, there's a lot of police departments that train their officers on how to respond. And these are often, of course, clear and concise policies and procedures. But I think this is great for officers to gain this information, have, whether it be printed materials or whatever for them to reference. I think it's really important for officers to be exposed to the reality of shootings I don't know if they need the statistics, but if I was doing the presentation, I certainly would. But you don't want to put any undue fear into an officer, but the reality is these officer-involved shootings are not only increasing, but the people that are being shot are drawing their weapons, whatever that may be. So anyway, I think it's important. They're also trained on like policies, like after the shooting, what are the policies, what are the procedures. They're notified of the possible requirement for them to complete some sort of evaluation before they return to work, and also their individual rights, what that may be. So there's a lot of legislation around it, but there's also state to state and department to department policy. So it's extremely important for officers to be trained in that. Also, I think, kind of backing up a little bit to the psychological first aid, many police departments appoint what are called response teams to deploy after an OIS, like immediately. And now these are not medical and not necessarily trained in a lot of clinical depth, but they're trained in the science of human performance factors, what affects high stress, time pressure, confrontations. And in my belief, I think these folks are really helpful and something we should probably implement, because it may be able to put the shooting into a more, I say better, healthier perspective for the officer involved, to have that interaction right away. I need a little sip of coffee. That's good. All right. So again, officers are trained on the importance of, just in general, taking care of their mental health and wellness pre and post shooting, including, and I think this is important for them to understand, that there may potentially be residual emotional, psychological, cognitive, and behavioral effects often associated with an officer-involved shooting. So let's not be too surprised if we see it. And officers are made aware of specific mental health and wellness services available to them. Either that be from, if they're veterans, too, going to the VA for some help, or through the department. People such as me, now, I would not be able to do counseling and a fitness for duty evaluation. That's an ethical conflict, which is beyond the scope of this, but I just wanted to point that out, that we would need to have two on the team, because I, again, would not be able to play that dual role. Anywho, so they're made aware of different mental health options in the community or through whatever organizations. And, their engagement in the mental health services could happen before or after they participate in the fitness or in the return to work evaluation. And then certainly an extreme, potentially traumatic event, such as an officer-involved shooting, can trigger complex effects that may not show up immediately after the event. And we've tapped on that before. Super, super important to keep an eye on these folks. All right, let's talk about how soon after a shooting should an officer or officers appear for their return to work evaluation. I will say that there's a lot of considerable conflict in this regard. There's advocates for people to get going with an interview, or even just the critical incident debriefing, like right then and there, round everybody up, and all of the emergency responders, and get them all in this immediate mental health intervention that, like I said before, a lot of people aren't ready for. So there's a lot of debate around that. And again, on the opposite side of that, there's a lot of advocates for delaying it. And I think that needs to be more thought of in individual cases. I don't know how else you would be able to differentiate, but it's going to have. There's a lot of considerations. Let me just back that up a little bit. So these officers are considered survivors, clinically, and they should be socially as well, in my opinion. So they need access to the mental health services. It's, a high intensity critical incident, but it could depend on, like I said before, that if there's a perceived culpability of the officer or officers involved, are they being investigated for violating the law and or departmental policies? So, especially on the legal aspect, if it's found at least immediately that it was an illegal shooting or against policy, they could be, the word that came to mind was sequestered, but I guess essentially that's how it would be. So, are they in jail? I guess essentially I should say. And of course, like I said, legal considerations, post-mental health interventions may need to be coordinated with law enforcement investigators, the courts, attorneys, certainly the jails if they are incarcerated and stuff like that. So, all right, so more officially, the IACP, Officer-Involved Shooting Guidelines, recommend that officers involved in an OIS be given a minimum of 3 days leave. That sounds totally cool. They're also allowing non-shooter officer participants, to have leave time after the OIS. That time is not necessarily determined. But for the shooter, they're saying a minimum of 3 days. The guidelines also recommend leave time for other. I just read that. Amy. Anyway, from a department's viewpoint, it is necessary that all officers reporting back to duty after an OIS are ready and mentally fit for duty, which is, of course, where that return to work evaluation comes in. There are a lot of liability implications for an agency that does not carefully monitor officers after traumatic events prior to resumption of their duties. Excuse me. So it becomes important that officers appear for their OIS for that fitness determination to be made. But the question is, how often does this timing not coincide with the officer's 3 days leave? Like, are we expected to intrude on that time off? That timing is confusing to me, and I wonder how much that does not coincide with the officer's time off. The department may be pressing for the return to work based on a myriad of reasons. And, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, they may not be ready. Okay? That's important. Not every officer will have the same severity of reaction as we talked about. The cognitive, emotional, behavioral, it may not look the same. It likely will not look the same from officer to officer. So we have to be mindful. They need to be mindful too. Are they ready for the return to work? That's rough because, we may be looking at like them being really out of sorts. The other thing that just popped into my mind is, what if they took off to Tahiti for that vacation they never got to? And we can't, they're taking those 3 weeks to Tahiti, or 3 days to Tahiti, probably not, but down to Galveston, shall we say, and get their relax on. Okay, that's also going to be a factor in when the evaluation can occur. But in the meantime, we're hoping that the officer has gotten some support again from the psychological first aid, possibly any of the community referrals that they received from the PFA facilitator. All kinds of different things are going to depend on that. So, I'll just end that on there. But long story short, we need the input of these officers. Are they ready to return to work? And therefore, are they ready to participate in a return to work evaluation? We need to be mindful of timing on that and respect and respond to the officer's input. All right. So what's covered in a return to work evaluation? So like I said before, the return to work is like an informal fitness for duty. So, and since this isn't a fitness for duty presentation, just be mindful that it's very, very similar. It's not looking for the same. No, that's not true. It's looking for the same thing. I would say the differentiation is more around the pre-employment as opposed to the FFTE or the fitness to work. So, anyway, the section 6.10 of the IACP Officer Involved Shooting Guidelines states officers' fitness for duty should not be brought into question simply by virtue of their involvement in a shooting or other critical incident. The mere fact of being involved in a shooting does not necessitate such an evaluation prior to return to duty. And I think that's really important to note. It doesn't have to happen, okay? And it doesn't always happen. So, again, as we said, this does not preclude an agency or a department from requesting a formal evaluation before the officer is allowed to return to work. It must be determined objectively if the officer is ready to perform their duties. An evaluation of how they were affected, if they were affected, and how specifically, and what can we do to get them into more of a restorative state, shall we say. So, anyway, just to know that a lot of officers, kind of like we talked about before, will be like, no, I'm fine, I'm cool. And you're like, notice them, coming in, not drunk per se, but like still having that scent on them from the night before, and or they get arrested for a misdemeanor, or they get caught driving too fast, or whatever the case may be. But at that point, the department can say, you're going to go ahead and take one of these evaluations. We need to know where you're at. And I think that's fair. All right. So, the first and foremost, the mental health provider will have the officer review and sign under a clear understanding an informed consent and a release of information. And this is so the mental health provider can receive and release the background and collateral information that is gained throughout the evaluation. But then, I think more importantly in this context is going over the limits of confidentiality. The mental health professional has to explain to the officer what will and will not be released to the department with or without their consent. Yeah, they might have learned that in their in their police training, but now the reality is this. They're expected to be open and honest about their reaction to an officer-involved shooting, and depending on the results, they're made aware that they could be deemed, not eligible for return to work. And then all kinds of other things branch off from that. So, it's also best practice to give the officers a copy of these signed documents. And I always say, and I've always done this. It's better for them to have hold in their hand what they have signed for their reference or not. But we can't make them read through the. Well, that's not true. We can read through these things with them, make sure that they understand and that they're knowingly and willingly signing these documents in order to participate in this either fitness for duty or return to work evaluation. So that's really, really big. Make sure you give them copies of everything. All right. The mental health provider is going to work to understand the officer's duties and their typical work environment, not the environment. Now, I think granted, if it's always kind of like an inner city situation where there's shootings all the time, that's going to be different from, a rural officer, for example, that typically it's super, super chill and everybody knows each other and blah, blah, blah. But then something happened with Harry and he went berserk and he started going toward an officer and he was shot, right? So I want to know, what is the typical work environment? Not that day. What's it like usually? Is it boring? Is it exciting? Is it, full of paperwork? Whatever. I want to know what their perspective is. Also, it's important for the mental health provider to gain an understanding of what exactly went on. Now, promise you, there's going to be reports read, media gone over, other evaluations reviewed and stuff like that on the officer, but it's super important to get the officer's perspective, their reaction to the event. Now, their reaction to the officer-involved shooting could give the mental health provider vital information about, I guess, on a more positive tip, like the officer's coping skills and how they react in a stressful situation, depending on what their reaction was to the event. But either way, it's important for the mental health provider to know that, or professional to know that. Now, of course, in some cases, they're going to ask for in part of that background information, they're going to ask for some past mental health records, if there are any. And that can have something to do with the determination. So, but the officer needs to be aware of that. Alrighty. So, throughout the evaluation, the mental health professional is expected to have the referral question from the department in mind the whole time. Okay. So, and have this in mind during using the evidence-based psychological assessments that evaluate personality, psychopathology, cognition, the other stuff that we talked about before. And they'll also conduct a clinical interview, and likely a mental health examination. Now, something about MSCs, they typically occur during these clinical interviews, and officers or other clients or whatever, they may not even know it's happening. We tend to utilize the clinical interview in order to complete either a brief or a fairly extensive mental status exam, which we can derive a ton of information from. So that's super important. And then, of course, possibly conducting interviews with the officer's collateral contacts and other relevant third parties. I would say attorney, but I'm not sure where that would come in. Anyway, we'll see. Alrighty. So the mental health provider is expected to write a fair, nonpartisan, and thorough report for the officer's department that contains, among other things, I would think, a description of the rationale for the return to duty, which, again, often references the department's referral question, the methods of the evaluation. Again, in a lot of, we're expected to not use super clinically terms or whatever. We're just supposed to write it out for a layman, essentially, for them to know what the methods were without a huge description of the scoring and the validity and all that kind of stuff. They don't need to know that. They don't want to know that. But they definitely want the results. Okay? What did you decide? there are oftentimes too when the mental health provider will be asked to give like a supplementary oral presentation to kind of clear things up, maybe answer some questions along the way. But yeah, it's important to communicate the results without being too technical and losing the audience is what I'm trying to say. All right, there's also a summary section that integrates the key elements from the findings in relation to the purpose of the assessment. Again, it all has to be intermeshed together. Decisions regarding an officer's return to work, including a clear determination of the officer's psychological suitability for return to work, based upon an analysis of all psychological assessment materials, including background, test data, and interview results. So all of that combined into a written report. Now, there very often will include some sort of what is the certification of the officer to return to work? Is it without any limitations? Everything's fine. With limitations or part-time. So we'll talk about some of the difficulty involved in that later, but again, is it without any limitations? Are they good to go? Do they have limitations, and what are those? It's if they need part-time hours or whatever, but they also need to know what is the length, right? How, if it is temporary, how long? What are the specifics of, go to the next slide. Well, no, we're not talking about that yet. We're going to talk about accommodation here in just a sec. So, according to the AICP guidelines, if the mental health professional came to a clinical diagnostic conclusion, they made a diagnosis of the officer. The report will only include that information if it is relevant to the officer's return to work determination. If not, the MHP is free to leave that out. And then another guideline, 11.6, the written report provided to the referring department, should be securely maintained in accordance with federal, state, and professional requirements, which I know to this point our department is really, really good with. So, all right, just real briefly, you have this slideshow, so I don't want to beleaguer this, but the return to work evaluation report includes the following information. And again, if there are limitations, the report needs to be clear on that. And again, temporary, permanent. If temporary, how long? If permanent, then what happens next? And we'll discuss that in a little bit. But we're looking at understanding of directives and procedure. Are they able to concentrate on tasks for extended periods? Perform activities within a schedule. That's important in police work. Make decisions. Interact appropriately. Obviously very vital. And, respond appropriately to changes. Are they, how are they doing, basically? So that is part of the determination of these 13 factors, and whether they have no limitation, some limitation, or significant limitation. I want to talk about, so if along the lines a mental health professional has a concern about an officer actually returning to work, what happens then? A couple of things popped up in my head when I started this portion. Police officers are distrustful of department-hired mental health counselors, such as myself, and I'm aware of that. Therefore, they may be unwilling to be forthcoming about their emotional, physical, and psychological well-being for fear of negative employment impact. I totally get that. I know we all totally get that. But if I or another mental health professional finds that it was persistent, this unwillingness to be open and honest throughout the evaluation, they're likely going to be hesitant to clear the officer for duty. And because there may be too much uncertainty, right? We don't like uncertainty in these decisions. Too much liability involved, right? So I think most of the time we are going to err on caution to not return them to work in these circumstances. But again, the other thing is we need to know if they are ready. Were they ready? I'll just leave it at that. We need to take heed to whether or not the officer is ready for these evaluations. All right. So a mental health provider may find that the officer is struggling with a chronic psychological illness, such as a depressive disorder and/or substance use disorder, which could, in all fairness, depending on the severity of the symptoms, preclude the officer for being cleared to return to work. There's also an issue with psychotropic medications, according to the ADA. I think I tap on that in a little bit. So, but the other thing too is depending on, again, I could do a whole presentation on this, depending on what's going on with the individual officer, they may need to see a neuropsychologist. And so that referral would be made by the mental health professional doing the return to work evaluation. Police officer psychological dimensions are always going to be looked at in the pre-employment, in the fitness for duty, in a return to work. And it's important to consider the social competence, teamwork, adaptability, flexibility, conscientiousness, dependability, impulse control, integrity, ethics, emotional regulation, stress tolerance, decision-making and judgment, we've talked about, assertiveness and persuasiveness, we've talked about, and avoiding substance abuse and other risk-taking behaviors. So if that's one of the psychological dimensions, that being of like substance abuse, and there could reasonably be a determination of, say, an alcohol use disorder with a particular officer, that is probably going to need to be reported, okay? Especially if, let me go to the next slide, there's such a thing called problematic recovery. The IACP talks about this quite a bit, and that's where an officer can't return to a healthy and balanced emotional state, which would obviously be a concern to the mental health professional and the department regarding the return to work. And again, you have this, I'm not going to go through everything, but I was going to tap on that. So stalled recovery looks kind of opposite of the psychological dimensions, or kind of coincides with the psychological dimensions. So, and I'm glad I'm tapping on this right now. So the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, notes that an officer taking psychotropic medications may be disqualified from returning to work. So that's, so for an officer suffering a stress reaction from an OIS, it may be a difficult decision for them to give up their antidepressants or their anti-anxiety medications, because at that point, if they're under successful monitoring and whatnot, seeing their psychologist, seeing their mental health counselor, whatever that may be, they may be what I call, they may be put into golden handcuffs. In other words, they need these medications to return to work, but in some ADA interpretations anyway, the ADA is like, nope, if they're taking some sort of psychotropic medication, that being Zoloft or Buspar, just like whatever, to help with their anxiety, help with their depression, they could very well be disqualified from returning to work. So there's, again, I could probably do a whole presentation on just that, but that's really important for us to consider, is maybe after post-shooting, the officer got relief from their anxiety and depression from psychotropics. Well, now they're functional, but the ADA says if they're taking these medications, then they can be disqualified from work. That's frustrating. All right. So police departments are typically unable to provide a reasonable APA-sanctioned accommodation for a standard police officer. And when I'm talking about street cops, patrol officers, so standard police, not like a duty sergeant or the desk officer or whatever, but guys and gals that are actually on the street. It's really, really difficult to come up with any kind of accommodation for them. So, and I like this quote here from Post, the availability of reasonable accommodations for officers to mitigate impediments resulting from emotional and psychological conditions is understandably quite limited. So they're even saying, you know, like, what are we expected to do? I guess essentially. Reasonable accommodation can take many forms, including assistive devices, modified work schedules, unpaid leave, and like restructuring jobs to remove marginal functions. And that's just to name a few. But this is when we're looking at officers possibly having to look at, well, taking a lot of time off probably isn't going to be well, and depending on the department. But we're looking at trying to make an accommodation for somebody that it's almost, I say impossible, but it's obviously case by case, but it's not an easy thing to do. All right. A reasonable accommodation that results in an undue hardship. Now, this is very important because we're going to see this a lot. Or not a lot necessarily, but I do believe we're going to see more of this. A reasonable accommodation that results in an undue hardship to the police department. So this is taken into consideration. If it's providing an undue hardship to the department and fellow officers, an accommodation, an ADA or otherwise accommodation is not required. So that's a little bit of the tougher aspect, I think, of our decision making on whether or not to return an officer that was involved in a shooting back to work. But the undue hardship isn't just financial and stuff like that, but also, is it going to be extensive? How long is this officer going to need accommodation, and what is that accommodation? What does it look like? Is it disruptive? And I think this is the pretty important part that would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business. So again, trying to make some sort of ADA accommodation for a street cop or a patrol officer is going to be pretty darn difficult. The ultimate determination of an officer's return is ultimately always going to lie with the department. And so that's really all I have for you today. Shout out. I appreciate you being here for this presentation. Please contact me with any questions that arise. You all have the electronic version of this PowerPoint. So if you go back through it and you're like, that made no sense, or she made no sense, please reach out to me. Let me just show you my resource page real quick. Actually, pages. All right. So again, thank you so much for your time and attention, and I appreciate you watching. Have a good night.